We are very fortunate to host Garo Paylan today and to have the opportunity to hear him speak on dissent and political opposition in Turkey, but also about his own personal family history as well as his political profile. Mr. Paylan has agreed to take questions, and we'll do that afterwards, so please hold your questions until then. It is a distinct honor and pleasure to introduce him. He, over the weekend, received the Freedom Award at the Armenian National Committee of America and took part in their grassroots conference. He also spoke to a packed audience at UCLA yesterday, and it wasn't more than this, so we're good. Where I actually met him, it was a great pleasure to meet him for the first time. We thank the ANCA as well as UCLA's Promise Institute for making his visit to Southern California possible, and of course Vahe and Armine Meruni for making today possible. I would also like to thank a few more, in particular Annabelle Adams and Mark Kanda, and of course the UCI police for all their efforts in ensuring a successful event. Thanks to Shant Kuyumjan in the back who is making a video recording of this event, and you will be able to see it within a week or two on the Armenian Studies webpage as well as the Facebook page. And feel free to like. Garo Paylan is a founding member of the People's Democratic Party, also known as HDP, for the Turkish Halkların Demokratik Partisi, a party whose two co-chairs and several other deputies remain under arrest. Mr. Paylan is from a family originally from Malatya in eastern Turkey, known for its apricots. And he is one of 3 Armenian deputies in the Turkish parliament. He is also a member of Turkey's Armenian community and has long been an activist on human rights as well as Kurdish and Armenian issues. Previous to joining parliament, Mr. Paylan served in the Central Committee of HDP and also served on the management of Armenian schools in Istanbul. He has long promoted bilingual education and minority rights in Turkey and has been actively engaged in raising awareness of discrimination towards minorities, the rights of the Armenian community in Turkey, Turkish-Armenian reconciliation, and especially on journalist Hrant Dink's murder case. Despite attacks, hate speech, and temporary suspension from parliament, Garo Paylan remains a courageous yet humble advocate for human rights of all peoples in Turkey. What resonates with me especially is this fact, that his message and his vision are universal, that they are not merely or just about the Armenians or the Kurds or their rights or their dignity or any other group. They are about the rights of all peoples of whatever ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, and so forth. Therefore, it is an especially great privilege to have him here among us. Please give him a warm welcome.
Parevses, merhaba. Hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Հարկելի դեր հայր առաջ, նախև առաջ։ Շատ ուրախ եմ, որ հոսեմ նախև առաջ։ Կարծեմ անգլերեն պիտի շարունակեմ. Hello everyone. I'm a member of the Turkish Parliament. And I always say I'm a human rights activist. I became somehow a member of the Turkish Parliament because, you know, we are in a struggle for years, for decades, I can say, and I was always a part of that human rights activism. But when I was born in a house, and there I had a grandmother. Her name was Siranush, and she was somehow silent. I was trying to talk with him, but she was always silent and not speaking, and I was always asking her, Grandma, where is your mother? Where is your sister? Why don't you have any relatives at all at her age? She was not telling anything about that. I tried to learn things from my father and my aunts and other relatives. Then I suddenly learned about the genocide, what happened in 1915. I was mad, really. But my father and my mother always told me you have to be silent, because we were silent for 80 years. We have to go on to be silent about that big crime, that big catastrophe. But I was mad. I wanted to tell about the people. I went to the college or the high school. None of my friends knew anything about it. Moreover, after an Armenian school experience, I went to high school, and my name was Garabet, of course. The shorter version is Garo. And they told, what kind of a name is this? I said, this is Garabet, and I'm an Armenian. And they asked me, where did you come from? Now, they didn't even know that Armenians were a very historical identity of that land. They didn't know anything about it. But I was told not to tell anything about that catastrophe. Years passed somehow, and there was uprisings about the Kurdish conflict, and there was a huge conflict, and people were dying. There were several assassinations in the southeastern part of Turkey, where we call the Western Armenia, the Kurds call Kurdistan, and the Turks say, no, it is all Turkey. There was a huge conflict. Tens of thousands of people were dying in those years, in the 1990s. Still, we were silent. Suddenly, we had Hrant Dink. I guess Hrant Dink. He is a very courageous journalist. He took courage from that struggle that Kurds were doing, and the Kurds were asking for their rights, and Hrant Dink got the courage to tell about the Armenian genocide and to ask for our rights. And suddenly, I was somehow 20 years old in those years. I took the courage from Hrant Dink. I became a board member of an Armenian school. I worked for bilingual language systems. I worked for the Armenian schools, Armenian foundations. And for years, I worked with Hrant Dink. I told about the problems of the schools, foundations, and he wrote about all of them. And again, that deep state, which have never paid the price of the human rights violations and their crimes, unfortunately planned an organization to assassinate Hrant Dink. I was always struggling for the human rights, and I tried not to be so much Armenian, Of course, I am proud of my identity. I am an Armenian, but to get stuck in your identity somehow is a disease. I struggled for other people's violations happened for just because of their identity. I went, let's say, even the cupboard of my friends who were conservative, they were not let to go into the colleges. And we struggled for them. For the LGBT rights, we struggled for them. For the Kurdish rights, or for other identical violations, we struggled together, and I had so many friends. Suddenly, they just came to our position, and we struggled together about the Armenian rights as well. And somehow, it healed me, because I knew that we have friends who were struggling for me, and we were struggling together for democracy. And suddenly they killed Hrant Dink, and I became more Armenian. And I had a job. I quit my job, and I went to Agos that day. Hrant Dink was lying on the pavement. And I never went back to my job and only stayed at Agos. Agos is the Hrant Dink's, newspaper, and I worked there for a year. That year, I knew more Democrat people, and let's say, we organized the funeral. I was one of the organizers. 200,000 people walked in that funeral, and I knew more Democrats, and we struggled for granting justice. For years and years and years, not only for the Armenians, of course, for all the human rights violations, we struggled together. In 2009, there used to be Kurdish parties, let's say, who only asked for Kurdish rights. We offered them to establish a new party, which is going to be all the People's Party. I am one of the founder members of that party. First of all, we had a Congress, and then we had the party for years. And afterwards, we established a party. I'm one of the founder members of that party. In that program, we say Turkey has to establish a new constitution which believes in equality for all the identities. And in my party's program, I'm proud to say that it is the first party which recognizes the Armenian genocide. And in its program, it's writing that HDP recognizes the Armenian genocide, and state has to pay the price of that genocide. That it writes in our program. And for all other, of course, violations about the identical violations, my party just tries to face the past and to establish an equal future for all the identities. But when we got power, that program got power. For years, we just told people that we can establish a peace and democracy in Turkey. The more we got power, the status quo was unhappy. We had the peace process for the Kurdish conflict, and 4 years, all the identities benefited from that. And my party, 2 years ago, got 13% of the votes. Moreover, because there were so much biased votes against the Kurds, against Armenians, 65% of the population, due to the polls, said, one day I might vote for HDP. Now I have biased votes still, but I might vote for HDP. That was a huge fear for the status quo, because they used to always follow the nationalist policies, and this was a huge threat for them that the status quo might end when we establish the democracy or peace process. And unfortunately, they started the war again, and moreover, they jailed our co-chairs, our deputies, 15 of our deputies, 78 of our mayors, chosen mayors, and 6,000 of our party members, 6,000. And you know what? In the world, so many people says that whichever party's 6,000 members, including their co-chairs, deputies, mayors, you jail them, that party collapses. But our party is still alive, and still we are appointing new ones instead of the jailed ones, and we are still struggling. Turkey is now living a very dark winter. And I can say Erdogan has established a fascist coalition with the fascist nationalist forces from the right wing and the left wing. And unfortunately, we don't have an opposition to oppose this fascist nationalist ideology. The main opposition party, when it comes to the Kurds, behaves like the same. They are secular somehow. They oppose Erdogan about Islamic way, but they work together when it comes to the Kurds, when it comes to the Armenians. They just behave just like same. We are the only party which is struggling against this nationalist coalition. And people are struggling, in Syria, in Iraq, in Turkey as well. And Turkey is living a huge chaos, But the Western powers, including United States, turned a blind eye on the human rights violations, let's say after, I can say, 2015. And Erdogan, let's say, about 3 million refugees came to Turkey from Syria because of the Syrian interior war. And Erdogan used that 3 million refugees as a weapon and sent some hundred thousands of them to the Western countries. And those days, when he started the war, when he was killing people, when he was bombing the Kurdish towns, Merkel, Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, Germany's prime minister, came to Turkey 4 times in 4 months and told Erdogan, please stop this refugee flow. And what do you want for that? Erdogan said, you are not going to criticize me about the human rights violations. And I am going to jail the co-chairs and the politicians, journalists, academics, who just signed a paper for peace, you know. You might see some professors coming from Turkey, they signed a paper saying that we should establish peace. That was it, what they said. And Erdogan said all of them are terrorists, and he jailed those academics. And Merkel signed that agreement, that unfaithful agreement, saying that I'm not going to criticize you about the human rights violations, and you're going to stop that refugee flow, and I'm going to give you 3 billion euros. That was the deal. And unfortunately, that deal poisoned the Turkish democracy, whatever left. Turkey has never been a democracy, but when we lose that anchor, that Erdogan just demolished all the institutions. As a parliamentarian, I can say our parliament is not functioning, cannot control the Erdogan. Judiciary is a stick in Erdogan's hand. Unfortunately, he is using against the opposition camp. The media is not functioning. He shut down so many medias which criticizes Erdogan, and now the rest of the media is just saying, long live Sultan, long live Erdogan. That is it, unfortunately. When those 3 institutions do not function, as you can see, let's say you have Mr. Trump here, he wants to do so many things, but somehow your Congress, Senate, or judiciary, or the media controls Mr. Trump. It is so understandable. He is chosen, of course, we have to respect him. But that 3 powers checks and controls Mr. Trump, as you can understand. And you have the decentralized power. You have states, governors, chosen mayors, so much thing. And they can somehow control that power as well. Erdogan centralized all the power in his hand nowadays. But he thinks he is so powerful. But I can say he is living the weakest days of his career. He thinks he is ruling the country. Of course, he is doing so much human rights violations, but he is digging his grave as well. He did a coalition with the fascist forces, which doesn't have any moral values, only cares about their power. And the military, as you know, if you use the military, they become your partner. And one day, as our former presidents, prime ministers taught, let's say in 1955, we had Adnan Menderes, some of you might know. And in, let's say, 1955, there was a 6/7 pogrom, 1955 pogrom. And Adnan Menderes thought, okay, it was for the Armenians, for the Greeks. He just opened the way for that violation. But 5 years later, in 1960, we had the coup, and the military forces hanged Adnan Menderes. Erdogan is somehow nationalist, somehow radical Islamist. But the nationalist forces are manipulating each other. And at the end, we will have, unfortunately, those power struggles again. And Turkish democracy is bleeding every day. But as I said, the Western powers turn a blind eye on what is going on in Turkey, including the United States. I have to address that this year is so similar to 1914 or 1915. In those years, another 2 fascist leaders, Talat Pasha and Enver Pasha, got the power 102 or 3 years ago. And they just demolished the Ottoman democracy and got the power in their hands. And the Western powers were there. The Brits, the French, United States, Russia, all of them were there. They were only caring about their interests. That was it. Ottoman Empire were allies with the Germans, and they turned a blind eye on the human rights violations, and Ottomans, Enver and Talat Pasha did the genocide. And they didn't pay the price for it because the Western powers did an agreement, the Lausanne Treaty, in 1922 with the Turkey, ignoring the Armenian genocide. And if you have a big crime, big catastrophe, which is unpunished, that unpunished crimes leads to new crimes. My family suffered the genocide. My grandparents, let's say. There were about 30,000 Armenians in Malatya. I am from Malatya. Only 1,000 orphans left out of that genocide. The Western powers ignored that genocide, and the Turkey ignored that, and Turkey established a new republic. The name was Turkey. They said Turks and Kurds will be the two identities of that state, and the Kurds were betrayed as well. Only 2 years later, and the Turks said, no, this is a Turk state. We are not going to give you the rights. And afterwards, what is left to the minorities? To be silent, unfortunately. I'm sorry. We had to stay silent. And there were about 300,000 Armenians left after the genocide. And now we have only 60,000 Armenians in Istanbul. Most of them are in Istanbul. Because, you know, the violations were going on. The unpunished crimes were leading to new crimes. And against Armenians, against Kurds, against Alawis, and against whoever asked for their rights. Because we couldn't make that fascist idea, fascist ideology to have a defeat. And the Western powers only cared about their interests, and Turkey was strategically very important. Still, it is important, and it is using that strategic importance. Let's say that those crimes went on, and at the end, we had AKP, the ruling party nowadays, Erdogan's party, and they were allies with the Gülenists. Do you know Gülenists? I don't know. Most of you might know. And Gülenists promoted Erdogan as a democratic leader. And for years, we benefited from that, you know. Turkey was on the way to European Union, and Erdogan was promoted as a Democrat, Muslim and a Democrat leader. And we were getting advantage of that. But at the end, the Gülenists' agenda was to get the power, not to make Turkey as a democratic country. And they had a power struggle with Erdogan. And in that power struggle, we had a coup attempt last year, as you know. And luckily, that coup attempt has failed. After that coup attempt, we called Erdogan several times, let's take a lesson out of this. But Erdogan said, this is a gift from God, no, that coup attempt. And he just did his coup after that coup attempt. He just jailed so many politicians and jailed journalists, academics. And now Erdogan, unfortunately, is in the hand of the status quo, and they are working together. So what can we do now? How can we get out of this chaos? No? Erdogan is an opportunist leader. He used to be a Democrat. He used to behave like a Democrat, but now he is like a very terrible dictator. He cares about his power, but he stops when he sees a barrier. I can give you an example. Last year, the military forces crashed a Russian aircraft at the Syrian border. And that night, Putin said, I'm not going to buy anything from Turkey. And there were about 5 million tourists coming from Russia. I said, I'm not going to send any tourist to Turkey. And 3 weeks later, only not 3 months, 3 weeks later, Erdogan went to Moscow, Russia, and said sorry to Putin. But as I said, Merkel's policy was just to make an unfaithful agreement with Erdogan. And United States, unfortunately, didn't care about the human rights violations, only business interests, trade, Incirlik Air Base, that was it. That brought us here, unfortunately. So to get out of here, Turkey is not Erdogan, believe me. Of course, he just raised the nationalist policies, and you think Turkey is a nutcase, and forget about Turkey. But maybe that is why the Western powers turned a blind eye on the human rights violations. But there are still millions of people who struggle and who only wants to live in a democratic country and live in peace, but they don't have an institution to get them out of this, and they don't have support from the Western powers. But what can I say is, the world needs a democratic Muslim majority country. Turkey is still the only candidate. There are radicalisms everywhere. Nationalism, radical Islamism, Islamophobia, and crazy people are killing people here in Vegas last week. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry about it. Everywhere, radical ideas. So some ISIS members are suicide bombers are doing terrorist attacks in the European countries. So how will we get out of this? Will we live the Mad Max era? No. There is a way, another way, to establish diverse safe havens all over the world, including the Muslim majority countries. And we still are the minorities trying to live in that Muslim majority countries. But we are suffering. If you don't care about it, and if you don't have a vision for the Muslim majority countries, we will not be able to live in those countries. Like so many of you, I guess there are so many Armenians here, they had to leave that country because of that kind of violent days after 1915, before 1915, in 1955, after 1980 coup. And now it is another dark era. If this atmosphere goes on like this, in 5 years, you won't see any Christian living in Muslim majority countries. And at the end, it will be the Muslim world and the Christian world. What is next? Everywhere radicalism. If you touch each other, you can say that Muslims are bad, Christians are good. You can say Garo is good, Ahmet is bad. But if you don't touch each other, leaders like Erdogan can easily manipulate that Christians are like this, Muslims are like that, and those radical ideas go over and over. And every kind of inequalities, will be deepened. And for the world's fate, we have to consider about this. We have to have a vision. We have to care about wherever in the world there is a human rights violation, we have to be an activist against that, to stop that. And we have to have a vision how to get out of this. Unfortunately, the world has lost the liberal order. Everyone is caring about him or herself, itself. And the new generation is, unfortunately, I'm sorry to tell it that, but more selfish. Everyone is running to, whoever is not happy with some places, running to safe havens. But we have to be, as an activist, establish safe havens everywhere. Even if you build walls, I guess Mr. Trump is going to build a wall somewhere. Even if you build the highest walls, believe me, if these things goes like this, that wall will not be enough. You can't establish your safe havens. As a human rights activist, we have to act wherever there are human rights violations. So maybe we can go on with Q&As. For now, thank you very much. What can I say? I'm sorry, I have a terrible jet lag for 5 days. And for 5 days, I couldn't sleep. Now, in the days, my brain is sleeping. At night, I'm awake. and programs. This is the last program. I'm sorry. After this program, I will go to fly back to Istanbul. And thank you very much.